everybody. Welcome back to Summer Bible Study. We're looking at the Psalms this summer. It's me, Pastor Chris, standing in front of what I think is the most boring wall in my home, trying to think of really good ideas for what should be hanging there. Go ahead and submit your ideas along with your sightings in the Psalms. So we are moving on today. We're talking about Psalm 62. At this point, I'm just randomly choosing Psalms, hoping that you send me one and you say, hey, here's a Psalm I'd really like to look into, or here's something that I'd really like to study. So go ahead and send those on. I'd be happy to look at those. For next week, I'm just telling you now, I'm going to take off a week. So just know that next week there won't be a Bible study, but I'll be back on June 30th with a video for you and a new psalm to look at. I wrote down Psalm 133 so that you have a plan for that, and then I'll look for your sightings. So thank you so much for those that you send sightings of things that you see. I've received a couple different things, reflections on the psalm that we looked at last week. I had someone else tell me about how God used a psalm in her own life to bring comfort in a time that she needed to be sure that God was there. Another person gave me a really cool image for the miry pit or the slimy pit that we talked about with Psalm 40. So please keep those coming. I think they're super interesting. So we'll start out by praying and then move right on into Psalm number 62. Thank you, God, for this day. I'm standing here on a Monday and the weather's changing again and it's getting really quite warm. So I thank you for summer days, Lord, the opportunity to be outside and get some fresh air. Fresh air seems to be what we need, Lord, when we have been cooped up for a while, fearful of a virus. So as always, I pray for you to eradicate this COVID virus, give wisdom to doctors to know how to create a vaccine or just wipe it out in a way that only you can. For those that are listening today, Lord, I pray that they would hear your words, that they would read this psalm and they would know that you are a God who surrounds them, who takes care of them, a God who provides, a God who helps us stand strong in difficult times. So thank you so much for your word. We love you too. Amen. So by quick review, we did 2 weeks ago an introduction to Psalms and learned about some of the things that the Psalms do, as well as a tiny peek at the very first Psalm, encouraging us to delight in God's Word, to grow our roots deep with God, and to stand strong. Last week was a glimpse at Psalm 40, where the psalmist writes about waiting for the Lord, being lifted out of the slimy pit of sin, and from that place being able to sing a new song and to be able to witness to what he had experienced so that others would see and know this God. So now we move to Psalm number 62. And the heading for this psalm, I said at the beginning, some of the psalms have headings that are specific. So this one is similar to Psalm 40. It says for the director of music, which means the writer was saying there's some kind of notes for whoever would have been the worship director or officiant, whoever would have led the liturgy at the time in the temple, and used that. So that's the heading for this psalm. That next line says for Jeduthun. Those two words are exactly the same in Psalm 39 and Psalm 77. The NIV, which I'm using, translates it as for, so it sounds like the psalm was written for a specific person, but it seems like the better word for that would probably be upon or concerning, and it means that it probably had to do with a melody or a tune for how this particular psalm would be sung. And then Jeduthun, the name of this person, is in Chronicles, David appoints 3 leaders to lead the choir in the temple, and Jeduthun was one of them. So these are instructions for this particular choir director on how to sing this song. And then it says a Psalm of David, which means it could be written by David or written in David's style. I'm going to assume that this is a psalm that was written by David today. I would like to say the overall theme for this psalm, if I was going to sum it up in one word, I would say the theme is endurance. And David is writing to encourage himself or to remind himself and then others subsequently, encouraging them to stand on the rock, which is God. To encouraging everybody to trust in God in the face of adversities, which he narrows down to being in the face when you're facing enemies. So that's what I would say is the picture of this psalm, what's happening here. So Psalm 62, the first 6 verses, do something that is characteristic of Hebrew poetry. So either you listened on week 1 when we did an introduction, or you zoomed through, or you just didn't make that one. But one of the characteristics of Hebrew poetry that we find in the Psalms is something called an inclusio. And it's basically a phrase that is spoken at the beginning and then is repeated somewhere else in the psalm. And then it's inclusio, it's including some things that happen in between. So in this psalm, it's verses 1 and 2, and then that are repeated almost verbatim in verses 5 and 6. Verse 1, truly my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. So those words are pretty close if you look down at verses 5 and 6. And they end up standing like bookends around another little chunk of phrases that David will put in there. But just let's look at this inclusio just a little bit. He says, truly my soul finds rest in God. So David is just describing his reality of being at rest, or this word again, translated in the NIV to finds rest. A closer translation would be silent. So he's saying something like my soul is silent, or then NRSV translates it, my soul waits in silence for the Lord. And I think it's a little bit of a richer meaning than just rest. Finds rest, we suddenly go, oh yeah, I know what that means. It means I'm at rest. But to talk about waiting in silence, or to have your soul be silent, I think is a deeper way of understanding that rest. I think it means that the depth of yourself, your person, is in a place where it can be quiet. It doesn't have to fill the empty void with conversation. It's not an incessant talking. It's not nagging or pleading or complaining or worrying or trying to even come up with plans or solutions. David says, in God, that is where my soul can be silent. I can rest in that place and not be hurried or worried in anything else. In verse 5, so this is the inclusio, this is verse 1, and then in verse 5, when David says it almost exactly the same, the Hebrew word that says be silent in verse 1 is a little bit different, or a little bit nuanced, and it would say, instead of saying find rest as the NAV does, one might say my soul stands still in God, or my soul can stand still in God. And so what he's declared in the first verse, now he's telling himself in verse 5, yes, my soul stands still in God, or find rest. He's reminding himself. So I would say what was a declaration in verse 1 is an exhortation in verse 5. And all of this reality about who God is, he says, truly he's my rock and my salvation, he's my fortress. And what all of that makes possible, the character of God makes it possible to have a soul that's at rest or silent or standing still and never being shaken or never being moved. So David declares, this is what reality is like for me because I have this relationship with God. So this inclusio then bookends basically has these two statements that says, this is how I can do this, and the only place that I can really find this rest or this peace or this standing still is in Yahweh. That's where I find that. And then these verses include or surround or bookend a description of then what David says his enemies are doing. So it surrounds the idea as he explains what the enemy is up to, and it's possible for him to stand, to be firm, to be quiet, even when the world all around him is being rocked and coming after him. One of the commentators said this inclusio, these 2 verses and 2 verses with other stuff in the middle, he said it serves to surround the attacking enemy with the power and protection of God. So the verses do that. They surround the verses about the enemy, and you get the sense that anything that the enemy is going to try is going to fail. This enemy might try and try and try, and it's not going to work. Or this enemy might seem powerful, but really is not powerful when surrounded by God. So the enemy in the middle of this passage, then verses 3 and 4, The enemy's efforts seem kind of simple and simplistic. Now, David talks about an enemy. He just kind of basically starts talking to this enemy. How long will you assault me? And we don't know who it is. He doesn't ever say it's a particular person, group of people, or even another nation that's trying to go after him. But when put in the context of what God does, it seems as if this enemy is more of an annoyance. And he says to them, how long are you going to keep this up? How long do you have to put up with what you're doing? You are the kind of person who kicks a guy when he's down. He said, would you throw me down this leaning wall, this tottering fence? He's referring to himself. I'm in a tough place, and then you seem to want to come then. It seems like he's calling out a bully, someone who comes and picks on somebody who's smaller, or somebody who takes advantage of someone when they are vulnerable or if they are weak. And he's basically saying, your intent is to bring me down. And he also says one of the ways they're trying to bring him down is by lying about him or maligning his character. He says they delight. So first he talks to them, how long are you going to do this? And then he steps back to say, this is what my enemy tries to do. With their mouths they bless, but in their hearts they curse. They take delight in lies. So the attack is less of a physical attack. I don't think it's necessarily a going to war attack, but there are some people who are trying to destroy his character. They speak against David. They tell lies about him. They're trying to convince other people to believe things about him. And so that describes what the enemy's trying to do. But then with these verses on the bookends or the ends of it, even though they try, David says, I will not be moved because I have a firm place to stand. God is my rock, God is my fortress, and I will not be shaken even in the midst of this. It's a beautiful passage right there to sit and say, what does it mean to have God surround you even in the midst of trials or torment or people that are out to get you in some kind of way? Verse 7 and 8, then he turns back to talking about God and where he really stands. And basically you get the idea that even though the enemies that try to attack David, it doesn't matter. His honor, he said, is dependent on God. They can say anything they want. I know who I am, and I know that my honor and my salvation depend on Yahweh. And these verses help transition from David's personal testimony about what he's experienced. And then after verse 8, he moves on and gives instructions to the whole community. So this is my experience, and therefore you should do this, or you should experience this. His own experience gives him the words to encourage and urge others to put their trust in God and to see their enemies for what they really are. So the last part of this psalm, verses 9 through 12, he does that, and he uses 3 aphorisms. Here's another tool that can be used not just in Hebrew poetry but used in English also. An aphorism is a saying that contains a truth. So it might be something that you commonly hear or use colloquially in a language. So the ones that David uses are similar. He uses these phrases and they're similar in structure, but they're also things that people might have heard in other biblical wisdom literature. You might find what he's saying in a similar way in the book of Proverbs, for one. And in this psalm, these 3 phrases or these 3 aphorisms will show that the only thing that makes sense to put your trust in is God. So he already started saying, I built my life on God. God is my rock and my fortress. And now he's encouraging others to do the same and basically saying, there's nothing else. There's nothing else to put your trust in. So verse 9, he talks about the lowborn and the highborn, and basically is saying you shouldn't put your trust in your social status or your position or the way you were born. I would extend it and say he's meaning you don't put your trust in your possessions or your home, or given all the conversation that we're talking about in our nation right now, and even in our own hometown, you don't put your trust in your race. It's not about being the white-skinned, or it's not about being those things that you put your trust in. They will not give you honor. They will not gain your salvation for you. They will not be a rock or a fortress to stand on when hard times come. And David's saying that everybody's equal. He says, the lowborn are a breath, the highborn are a lie. High and low, powerful, unpowerful, everybody's equal, meaning everybody's equally in need of God. Everybody needs Yahweh. The only real place to stand is not in your position, not in your privilege, not in your power, not in your birth, not in your possessions. The only place that anybody has to stand in the midst of turmoil and pain and attack is to stand on the rock, to stand on God and in relationship with Yahweh. Verse 10, the second aphorism, he talks about extortion and riches, and essentially is saying money is another thing that you shouldn't put your trust in. This is reminiscent of Ecclesiastes too. The writer of Ecclesiastes talks about, I tried all these things and nothing meant anything. So money isn't where to put your trust, and the desire for money can lead to evil practices, extortion and stealing, taking advantage of others. And again, then the thing that you should understand is the only thing to put your trust in is God. And then the last two verses, verses 11 and 12, he kind of uses the same form. It's a little bit different phrase, but he talks about one thing and two things. One thing God has spoken, two things I have heard. And in contrast to the first two aphorisms, he uses this one to tell what he knows about God. So the other two he was talking about, this is the reality that there's nothing more important than a relationship with God. There's nothing else to put your trust in. But now he uses this one to say, this is what I know to be true about God. There's one thing God said and two things I've heard. Now I need to be super honest with you right here. I can't figure out the math. Exactly. I don't know what is the one thing that God has spoken. And if God only spoke one thing, how it is that David has heard two things. So I'm just going to let that one go. That's verse 11. But he basically names the two things that he knows to be true about God as he's making his case for God to be the only one that you put your trust in. And he basically says, here's what I know. God spoke this. I heard it. This is what I stand on. Of this I am sure. He says, God is powerful and God is love. He says, power belongs to you, God, and with you, Lord, is unfailing love. And these two things together, God's power and God's love, form the basis of why he believes he can trust in God. So you kind of think about it. If God was only powerful, then you could see the evidence of God's power. You could see God at work. You could see God doing mighty things. But you would never know how to trust God because you wouldn't know how God was going to use that power. If God was only love, then his love would be really good and it would feel good to be loved by God, but God wouldn't be of any help if God was powerless. So this combination of God's power and God's love is what David would say, this is where I am putting my trust. And no matter what you say about me, no matter what comes at me, no matter who's out to get me or the circumstances of my life, I will put my trust in God. Only in God is where my soul finds rest, where my soul can be silent, where my very soul, the depth of my being, can stand still. I can stand on the power and love of Yahweh and not be shaken. So that's a little bit shorter psalm. I want to leave you with a couple reflection questions and remind you next week we'll be off, but be back on June 30th with Psalm 133. But in the meantime, here's a couple questions that you might want to think about as you read back through this psalm. One is, what does it mean for you, for your soul to find rest in God, or to be silent in God, or to stand still? So just think about that. What does that mean for you personally? What would I say? You know what? When my soul is at rest, my soul is silent. What does that feel like? What does that look like? Why does that happen? And why is God part of that? Secondly, the inclusio of those verses at the beginning in verses 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 that kind of bracket to talk about the enemies. Those words seem to render an enemy impotent. David's enemies seem to have nothing against him or no power to really stand or to topple him over because of who God is. So I want to ask you to wonder these questions to yourself. Do I feel like I have some kind of enemy? Is there someone that I would say is an enemy? Not necessarily because you'd say you hate them or you want to hurt them, but is there someone or something that makes you feel like someone's out to get you? And the second part of that, if not a human enemy, because frankly, you maybe don't have one. If it's not a human enemy, we have a common enemy as followers of Jesus, and it's Satan. There's an evil one who's trying to topple us, who's looking for us when we're weak and vulnerable, who wants to feed us lies and tell lies about us, and to call us names. And so given that as your enemy in verses 3 and 4, then how do the words in the inclusio, how do the words in 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 surround the effort of that enemy and render Satan impotent? When you read about who God is and how your soul finds rest in God, how does that make you say, okay, there's nothing that Satan can throw at me that I cannot stand in? And then the third part, just at the end, from the end of the psalm, ask yourself, how does the combination of God's power and God's love give me rest? How's that a firm place for me to, I'd say two things. How's that a place for me to find rest or comfort or peace or a silence? And how is that a place that I can stand firm? So go ahead and think about those things. I hope that you will. You'll read through this again and wonder those things. It's great to be here. And I'll see you in 2 weeks for Psalm 133. Bless you.